Pauline Latham, tell me about your upbringing, your childhood.
Well, I was born in Lincolnshire, so I'm a Lincolnshire yellow belly, which not many people know what that means. And I was born to parents, but my parents split up when I was born. My mother left the hospital and went home to her parents because she couldn't cope with being married any longer and had to leave her eldest son because I was being brought up in a pub. And in those days, it was thought that a pub was a totally unsuitable place for a child to be brought up. So I was brought up basically by my grandparents for the first few years because my mother had to go out and work because she didn't have a job and she had to go and get a job so that she could pay for me and look after me and also pay her parents who didn't have an awful lot of money to be able to live there. So it was a bit tough, and my grandfather actually spent most of his time with me because my grandmother ran the pub. But then unfortunately my grandfather was ill and he thought he had cancer. So at the age of 46, he decided to die by suicide. He actually hung himself in the barn, which was a very, very difficult thing. And even though I was only 2 at the time, I do remember him before that time because I spent all my time with him. So that was a pretty difficult thing. And then my mother went on to marry and have 3 more brothers for me. And so I was one of 5, and 4 of them were boys and I was the only girl. So interesting to be brought up with all men in the family.
And so your mum was a single parent, a lone parent?
Yes, which was unusual in those days. No benefits. She had to work to be able to keep me and to be able to pay for everything that she had. So that was tough. And she did that for 3.5 years until she married again.
What did she do, your mum?
She was, well, at that time, she was sort of a secretary, I think in a typing pool, and she married her boss in the end, which is an interesting situation. But, you know, opportunities for women were not there. As secretaries, you had to be. And in Lincolnshire, there were not many jobs for women.
Did you go to university, Pauline?
No, I didn't go to university, which in a way now I regret, but at the time I didn't. I found it really hard to cope with exams. I'm not an exam person. I'm not somebody who can cram and spout it out. It took me a lot. I'm much better on continual assessment than I am on sudden stuff. So I didn't really want to go to university. And in fact, the opportunities for girls when I left school was you were a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, or a hairdresser.
Yeah.
And those were my career options.
Which one did you choose?
I didn't choose any of them. I actually went to work, and you won't remember this. There's a shop called Griffin and Spalding's in Nottingham on Slab Square, because by that time I'd moved to Nottingham, and that was the Debenhams,
Yes.
which it became the Debenhams, but it was a very, very high-class store, and I worked in, would always term, the middle model dress department, because it wasn't the top model, and it wasn't the everyday, it was in between. So it was a really interesting place to start because I did learn about customer service, which is very useful as an MP because you do need to do customer service as an MP.
You had a real job.
I had a real job.
Good for you.
Actually, what was amazing in those days, you could walk out of school into a real job. You could work. And then I went to work in a bank later on. So I've had several real jobs. And then I had a family, and again, there were no opportunities or few opportunities to go back to work as a mum. So I didn't work for a number of years, but did a lot of voluntary and charity stuff. So I've had a very varied life, and you could say, well, what prepares you to be an MP? Well, everything and nothing. There is no job description as to what you need to do. And many MPs now, they're nearly all graduates. They've nearly all worked in sort of quite high-powered jobs. Many of them worked in London, and London isn't what the country's all about, in my view. I think you need to get a job and live in what I would term the real world outside.
I agree with you. I think we need more MPs from
normal backgrounds.
Normal backgrounds.
Yeah.
And when people say, what's normal? Normal people know what normal is.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, indeed. Was it a political family?
It wasn't. My stepfather, who brought me up, who was my mum's boss, he actually went to nursery school with Margaret Thatcher. It was called kindergarten in those days. And also his father was Alderman Lee with Alderman Roberts in Grantham. So they were very close with the Roberts family.
Wow.
Obviously, once she went on to a girls' school and he went away to public school, they didn't see each other then. But the families remained very close. And actually, the older generation built Grantham Hospital. My grandfather, step-grandfather, was actually one of the founders of Grantham Hospital. So quite an interesting going from being with a single mother to that sort of background. And we weren't part of that part of the family. We were, if you like, the sort of distant part of the family, because my stepfather had married a divorcee, and that wasn't seen as a very good thing to do. So life's been checkered over the years.
How old were you when you joined the Conservative Party?
Well, I joined it when I was 18, but then I lapsed when I came to work in London for a couple of years and then go back to Derby. So I joined it properly when I was 39. Oh. So a long time ago now. But that was when I started to... Yes, it was quite late. But I've been busy having babies and doing all sorts of different things. So I wasn't a committed politician by any stretch of the imagination. It was only because of this thing that threatened my children's future that I decided I'd better get involved, because if you don't get involved, you can't really criticise if somebody does something you really, really don't agree with. You need to get up and stand up and fight for it. So I joined the first committee of my life, and it was a school PTA, and the school PTA had to fight it because the governors in those days were all political appointments, bar two. And so they all voted with the politics of the day to get rid of the sixth form, even though most of their kids went to it. They didn't want it because they were told not to want it. And so those of us who did believe in fighting it did, and it took a lot of fighting. We had an adjournment debate, funnily enough, in Parliament. We did petitions, we had articles in the paper every week, we had debates on the radio, local radio, all sorts of things, and we won. We beat the leader of the council, and he was furious. And then I decided, if politics is going to affect my kid's life in that way, then I better get involved. So I went on the county council in a by-election, and then I went on the city council, and I did both for a year, and then I think I always realised that actually I needed to be in Parliament to really have an impact. So that's why I decided. I campaigned 23 years to get to Parliament. It's not like it is now. They didn't want women in Parliament in safe seats, the Conservative Party, that is. And actually, although I don't agree with all women shortlists, I think it has transformed what's happened in Parliament. That's why there are so many women. So although I don't agree with it, and I still don't agree with it, it did move things on. And it did mean that women now don't have to wait 23 years. It's a long time.
You were going for selections?
Yes.
Parliamentary selections for 23 years.
I was.
And you don't... Pauline, what I'm thinking now is like, I don't understand, because you joined the party at 39. I can't even do the maths. Well, you're aging well, is what I was saying.
Well, I was 62 when I got to Parliament. It took me a long time.
Really?
Yes.
God, I had no idea.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I won't tell you now on national television how old I am, although you can do the maths.
Wow. So, gosh, 23 years going for selection.
And all over the country. I went to Mid-Dorset, I went to Tatton, I went all over.
What is the worst question as a woman you were asked in those selections?
Oh, there were some pretty awful ones. I wasn't actually asked it, but somebody was asked, you've had one child, how many more do you intend to have? And I do know that women were asked at that time, well, how's your husband going to cope when you're in London all week? Well, husbands have to cope. Women have to cope if the men go away. You'd never ask that question as a man. So there were many sexist questions, which was because the Conservative Party in those days was made up of mainly old men, not many women, and the women wouldn't have dared to ask anything else. They wouldn't have dared to say to the chairman or whoever, you can't ask that. It was not done. So all sorts of inappropriate questions were asked, and you had to answer them. And I mean, there's questions about will you move to the constituency, all those sorts of things, which I understand, but the sexist ones were appalling. And I have to say I didn't get that bad a one, but lots of women I know did.
You talked about your children. In December 2018, you lose your son, Ben. Tell me what happened.
Well, he'd been in hospital in the afternoon. He'd been discharged, being told you've got transient amnesia, because he couldn't remember why he'd gone into hospital. And then he was sent home saying, well, we can't find what's wrong with you, and this is what's wrong with targets. I'm absolutely convinced it was the 4-hour target that they said, oh God, we're getting close to that, get him out. And sent him home saying, come back if you're not better in the morning or if you feel worse. And that night he died. And he died from something called an aortic dissection. And most of your viewers will never have heard of that, because you don't hear about it till it affects your family. So since then, I, with 2 others, have set up a charity, and it's the only charity in this country that deals specifically with this very niche aortic dissection. And it's about education for professionals to recognise it, because sometimes it's when the paramedics bring the patient into hospital and they have handover notes, but the doctors are too busy to bother to read them, and they think, well, we'll assess this, by which time the immediate problem has gone. You can't tell that somebody's having an aortic dissection because it's excruciatingly painful to start with, and then it goes off or can go off. So I think this is what happened in Ben's case. He didn't get diagnosed because they didn't actually do the right tests. And had they done a CT scan, he might still be here. So we've set this charity up, and we have got so many people doing things for us, but actually it's more about education. And now we've commissioned some research, or in the process of commissioning research, to try to find out why it happens. There are underlying health issues that some people have, but the majority don't. 2,000 people a year die that do not need to die. A lot are saved, and I'm not saying the whole of those 2,000 would live, but a good proportion of them would if they had the surgery, and you can be saved. It's not that rare, which is what some doctors say, well, it's a rare condition, you'll never see one in your professional career. They should be doing, they should be identifying it. So we're doing that, and we have somebody called Whispering Bob Harris, who is our ambassador, who's doing some amazing work for us, including filmed interviews with patients so that we can put them on the website to just try and help people come through this terrible, terrible situation. Some people who survive are traumatised because it is massive surgery. It's 12 hours long. It's big, big stuff. And you can have your whole aorta replaced. People make replica aortas to be put into people's chests, and people survive with that. So it's an incredibly rare, to the normal person, disease. It's not that rare. And we want to make sure that those people who go into hospital, like Ben, come out alive instead of coming out and then dying in the night. And it should never have happened. It just shouldn't have done.
Where are you on this stage of the grieving process?
Still difficult.
Okay.
Very difficult.
Okay. We're elected at the same time.
Yes.
I spent all my time on the opposition benches, so I'm not really sure what I achieved in Parliament. What's your biggest achievement in Parliament?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I was on the council, I was always on the opposition benches, so I know exactly what it's like. You do nothing, you can't achieve a thing. But now I'm in Parliament, I can, and I am doing. I'm partway through getting a new bill to stop children being married under the age of 18. And that's all children, boys and girls. It predominantly affects girls, but it does affect some boys. And it's too young. I mean, they're children. If they can't sign for themselves and make a decision that is a crucial decision and a life-changing decision to get married, they shouldn't be doing it. They should not be being allowed to get married. So we are stopping that, and I hope it will be law by Easter, which is amazing. So when I leave Parliament, there will be one legacy. I hope there might be 1 or 2 more before I finish, but that's one legacy that I will have. And I'll be able to point to my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and said, I did that. And that's really important, because as a backbencher, I've never wanted to be a minister. I'm not bothered about that at all. I want to be a good backbencher. And by doing that, I will have done something significant.
What do you think people most get wrong about you?
I think they get it wrong. They think I've been born with a silver spoon in my mouth. And I'm not saying I didn't have quite a privileged background once my mother remarried. So privileged to the point that we started off with 3 cars when most people didn't have a car. But my stepfather was not a good businessman. So although he'd got a business, he'd lost the whole lot. And he ended up almost with no money at all. So instead of, like most people, go from rags to riches, I went from rags to riches to rags as a family. We didn't have any money at the end. And so people do believe that I've had a silver spoon in my mouth, and they just don't know the truth at all. There's much more I could tell you. And in fact, people tell me I should write a book, but I don't think I've got the energy. But life is different. And as you say, you don't hear in Parliament these backstories at all. Nobody knows about it. And so they continue to think that I've got a silver spoon in my mouth. And that's not true at all. I think I'm quite grounded because of the experiences I've had and the empathy I can have with people who have had difficult times, because I've had difficult times.
And that is exactly why we do these interviews. Pauline, Latham, thank you. Fascinating experiences, life experience and tragedy too. Thank you.